Well, this morning I'm very pleased to have with me Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, the senior scientist at Creation Ministries International. Welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, opinions, and knowledge on various issues. We try to get as many people as we can in here, specifically for the class on scientific apologetics I'll be teaching at the end of June at Veritas International University. And then
Where's that?
I'm sorry?
Where is the Veritas International University?
It's in Santa Ana, California. So you do represent Creation Ministries International, which is specifically within the spectrum known as a Young Earth Creation Organization.
Correct.
So how did you come personally to the conclusion that the Earth is of more recent origin than is commonly taught in the science books?
Well, I think there are some scriptural reasons. Because the Bible does seem to teach that, and that's what the church and Jewish scholars thought until the rise of uniformitarian geology around the year 1800. You didn't get old Earth views in the church until there was a reaction to the old Earth science, which suggests to me that this is what the Bible's teaching. And then you get the issue of death and sin. Dr. Geiser even responded to Charles Templeton on this, who was worrying about, well, why would God create things that hurt and destroy each other? And Dr. Geisler said, well, no, God didn't create them that way. God created them vegetarian. Okay, so that's because there's no human or animal death before sin. But see, all the old age views are going to put death before sin. You can't really get around that. And then there are a lot of, when you look at the different clocks that you could use to measure age of things, I think there's always assumptions behind clocks, but most of the clocks actually give you a much younger age than people tell you about. There are certain things I can talk about later. I think are on the schedule, but I think actually the majority of clocks do point to a much younger age than the millions of years that people bandy around.
Mm. So for you, it was then primarily scriptural and then the science also confirmed that, or vice versa, or kind of a blending?
I think there's an integration, really. It's sort of a long time ago. I've been working for Creation Ministries since '96, and I was interested in the issue for many years before that. So it's a fairly long time ago. But I think that the issue of death and sin was a big scriptural thing. Because I don't see how you escape the fact that you got human and animal death before Adam's sin. If you have the millions of years and the secular dating methods, you're always going to put humans, fossils before where Adam could exist. But then you got the different clocks that you see, and there's certain things that have come along since I started the ministry, like the soft tissue in dinosaur bones has been quite an interesting thing. The rate group discussing things like radiocarbon being found in things where it should long ago have decayed, because carbon decays really quickly, half-life of 5,730 years roughly. Okay, so do the mathematics. After about 100,000 years, there should be no detectable carbon-14 left in something. So if you find it there, it means it hasn't existed long enough to decay. And we find it in diamonds and coal and dinosaur bones. So I think it's actually quite powerful scientific evidence for a much younger Earth than people bandy around.
Sure. So when you say carbon-14, is carbon-14 produced naturally within nature? Does it come from ground sources, or where does carbon-14 typically come from in nature?
Well, they believe it's cosmic rays hitting nitrogen-14 and causing a nuclear reaction which produces carbon-14, which slowly decays back to nitrogen-14. And the theory is, if you've got a living creature, living creatures exchange carbon-14 with the environment, so they're reaching equilibrium, but once the creature dies, and if it's kept in a closed system, the carbon will no longer be exchanged, and therefore it'll decay over time.
To the kind of a rest state of carbon-12.
Yeah, well, no, it's the carbon-14 decays into nitrogen-14.
Okay, nitrogen-14. Okay, so.
But what they do is measure ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14, you see, and that's what they're measuring. But the thing is, you've got things like diamond, which is as closed a system as you can get. It's the hardest substance on Earth, except for the human heart, maybe. And see, once the diamond crystal's formed, nothing's getting in or out of that system. So if they find a diamond with carbon-14, it must have been there when the diamond was first formed, incorporated into the carbon. And if it's there now, it means it hasn't existed even 100,000 years. Otherwise, it would have gone.
Mm. So, and carbons, which are traditionally associated with great ages and great pressures, must be more recent because the carbon dating based within them would make it more recent.
Well, the high pressure is it's an interesting thing in itself, because diamond is is an unstable phase at normal pressure. You see, diamond is dense, so it's favored by high pressure. It's unstable in relation to graphite. Okay, the kinetics is very, very slow, so you're not going to lose your diamond ring that you gave your wife or whatever. It's not going to decay, okay? The decay rate's too small. But the thing is, how do you go from graphite to diamond? You must have high temperature so the atoms can rearrange themselves at high pressure, so diamond's the most stable phase. And you have to quench that, which requires a supersonic eruption. Otherwise, if it was moved slowly through the Earth's crust, it would anneal back to graphite. If it's warm still and the pressure is released slowly, it's going to turn back to graphite. But if it actually is quenched in that high pressure phase, it's going to stay diamond. So it points to a very catastrophic process, but also not very long ago.
Okay, so since you clearly believe the Earth is more recent creation, what do you do with the issue of starlight that theoretically comes from, say, 4 million light years away or something of that sort?
Well, the point is that everyone has, the issue is light years compared to the number of years, because light year is a distance measure only. It's not a time measure. Now, if you assume light is going at current speed, 4 million light years, it's taken 4 million years to get there. But the point is, every viewpoint has more light years than years. That's what I think people don't realize. The Big Bang has this thing called the horizon problem. If you think of the Big Bang, nothing exploded, became everything, huge difference in temperature all around. But when you look into distant space now, the temperature is almost uniform. So the point is, how do you go from very different temperatures to very uniform temperatures? It means you have to have energy from hot things to cold things. And the fastest this can happen is the speed of light. But then you look at the math, and the universe is about 10 times too big or more for the temperature to have equalized in the Big Bang time frame. I mean, you look at distance this way, look at distance this way, same temperature, they've never been in contact. So the evolutionists are pointing to a much faster expansion of space called inflation. That's faster than light expansion of space. That's how they try to get around their own distance to light problem. They've got to have faster than light expansion of space, or some have actually proposed light was much faster in the past. So evolutionists have their same distance starlight problem as anyone else does. And no matter which position you have, you've got more light years than years. So when you look at some of the creation models, they're also pointing to a expansion of space much faster than light. That's when God stretched out the expanse, probably the Rakia on day 2, continued doing it till day 4 when the sun, moon, and stars were created. So if the evolutionists are allowed to use this sort of explanation to explain their distance starlight problem, then creationists are allowed to do the same.
So many people, and many of my friends would say that God created the light in between when he created the stars and everything else in the heavens. Is that?
Would you please tell them from me that they should not be using that explanation, okay?
Okay.
I don't believe that explanation.
I'm not going to say I'm not going to say my scientist friends, but friends.
I think this puts an older creation explanation, but I have a problem with, I think you alluded to yourself, is that we have a supernova exploding, but the light created in tangent is saying, well, nothing actually was there. It's just light beams that looked like something exploded. And there are also other things, the neutrino bursts. You see, supernova, you got this collapse and then a bounce, and you got this enormous burst of neutrinos. Neutrinos are ghostly things that just go through matter.
Right.
And then we see a neutrino pulse before the light pulse. Okay, light created in transit would say, well, God created a neutrino pulse before a light pulse to make it look like something had exploded, but nothing really has, you see.
Okay.
So I disagree with light created in transit.
Okay.
You see, I've explained the difference. There's a difference between God creating something mature,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is what he's done. He created Adam and Adam as an adult, trees which are already bearing fruit, but he didn't create appearance of age. I don't believe in appearance of age.
Mm. Do you
I
think
believe in creating with maturity.
Yeah, so you believe that appearance of age would kind of make God deceptive in some sense.
That worries me. I explain that more in my commentary, but I think that's what the distinction I want to stress, though. It's
Sure.
functional maturity, not appearance of age.
Okay. All right, so you've kind of already addressed this, but I'll ask it anyway. So did a supernova that we detect from distances greater than 100,000 light years come from a star that never really existed? I think you've already answered that.
I believe it did exist. I believe it did explode, but I mean, I presume that God created stars and different varieties of stars. You see, there are problems of trying to explain the first stars, because you think of a gas cloud, it would have to have the mass of 100,000 suns to have enough gravity to compress under its own weight, because gas wants to expand.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem of the first stars after the Big Bang is a huge one. When you look at the theories of star formation, they always involve pre-existing stars, like a supernova exploded, so it creates a shockwave, but you need a star to produce a supernova. Or you have to have dust grains to cool off the gas so it's less likely to expand, but you don't get gas until the elements are produced in the furnace of a star. So, I mean, the problem of first stars is a vexing problem for evolutionists.
Sure.
Neil deGrasse Tyson admitted it. They said if we didn't see stars, we'd have very good reason to assume that stars could never form. And he's an evolutionist.
Yeah, certainly. He's no friend of faith. I know that.
Oh, gosh, no.
He was raised Catholic, by the way, and gave up.
Oh, was he?
Yes, he gave up his faith in high school. He got interested in science and decided that he didn't really want to go to that side of the spectrum, so to speak, of ways to approach life. Yes.
And I think it's the faith that underpins science, and it's what historically has been the case. That was a Christian worldview that was that science was a handmaiden to theology. It was a Christian worldview that brought about science in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's God's nature that underpins the regularity of laws within the universe, and why our minds can understand the universe is because we're made in His image. There's so many various ways you could take that all point towards God as the creator. I absolutely agree with that.
Well, I mean, the atheist view doesn't give you a justification for regularity of the universe. So he's actually assuming regularity, but it actually stems from a Christian worldview of a divine lawmaker.
I can think of two publications that come to mind immediately when you say that. The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and the Natural Sciences, the paper that talks about how it's unreasonable to expect that something we created, mathematics, in our mind can predict things in nature. That from a naturalistic perspective is inexplicable. And the second one is Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist. His book.
Oh yeah, interesting guy. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. I love that book, God, Mind and Cosmos, because the subtitle, why the neo-Darwinian materialist paradigm is almost certainly false. So even from their side, some of them will honestly look at the evidence and say, we have problems. And that's good, that there's at least a few people who recognize that. So there's some people call themselves evolutionary creationists. Some people that's the newest term. I didn't know if you knew that one. So there's old Earth creationists or progressive creationists. Then there's young Earth, and there's actually, of course, Christians who just follow intelligent design and don't really put much into to when things happen. Just there's a behind it kind of idea. I think they're trying to follow more of the Philip Johnson's wedge strategy, where you kind of break off naturalism from science, that kind of idea. But
you can actually make the dichotomy between naturalism, or you can talk about a dichotomy of world history. You see, do we have a uniformitarian view of world history, or do we have the biblical view of specific acts of creation plus a judgment at the fall and judgment at the flood, you see? So you can talk about two rival views of history. And a deficiency, I think, of the ID movement is that they don't have a history of design. So I think they've always been vulnerable to the idea, well, why would God make something that hurt something else? And did God design things incompetently if they went extinct? See, if you had the fall and the flood, you can answer those.
Yeah.
Darwin's opponents were intelligent design theorists.
Right.
They didn't call themselves that, but that's what they were.
Based on those various viewpoints, how do you see the chronology of Genesis 1 to 11? How do you see that happening? Do you see it happening the one day here, or how do you?
Well, I mean, I think when you look at the Ten Commandments, you got this passage in Exodus about that we work for 6 days, rest for one, because God created in 6 days and rested in one. And that to me points to the days of creation were meant to be a pattern for our working, which means they were ordinary days, and one day after another with no gaps in between. And also points to God actually working in history to be an example for us to work in history, because not much of an example. God didn't really work in history. Why are we working in history? So I think that's what people like E.J. Young pointed out a long time ago, responding to the early framework hypothesis. He basically pointed out that the Exodus 4th commandment seems to indicate that the days were ordinary days, as well as the grammar of a day with evening and morning and number. And Jesus also said that Adam and Eve were there from the beginning of creation. There are a few things in the New Testament. Paul calls Adam the first man, and he talks about sin and death coming through Adam, the first man, which is why Jesus, the last Adam, came to die for our sins. So a few things like that, I think, point to an age of around a bit over 6,000 years. I'm not going to quibble over a few 300 years or so, okay? But I think around about 6,000 years if you use the Masoretic text anyway.
So you're not Bishop Usher?
I'm not that's I calculated a date of about 4175 BC. I'm not going to quibble about.
Sure, I understand that. Genealogy, sometimes father of, could mean not directly father of, so it's hard.
Well, I think in Genesis 5 it is, though, because you actually have the age of the next. See, Adam was 130, became the father of Seth. So there's 130 years between Adam and Seth. Even if Seth was a grandson, great-grandson, whatever, there's still 130 years between the names there. See, there's no time gap.
I see.
In Genesis 11 and 5. Even if there are people gaps, there's no time gap. And some of them are clearly, I think Adam clearly was the father, because Adam and Eve both named Seth. Lamech named Noah. Terah and Abraham, they were companions together. Noah and his 3 sons were companions. I think they look like direct father-son relations. Yeah. But I don't see any time gap possible. The difference is how long was the sojourn in Egypt, for instance. Long or short sojourn, were some of their kings' reigns overlapping or consecutive, and judges. That's where I think the leeway comes in.
I think the next couple of questions I was going to ask you, you kind of covered as far as animal death before the fall, what motivates your understanding. We've already kind of covered that. So
I know that Dr. Geiser agreed there was no the animals were created vegetarian, which is interesting.
That specific part I didn't know, but there's a lot of, he's written over 100 books, a lot of stuff.
At least Strobel wrote a book, I think, Case of Christ. He was basically responding to Charles Templeton, the famous apostate. I mean, Billy Graham was Charles Templeton's outsider, okay? That's how famous he was. And Dr. Geiser was one of the people he interviewed, and he answered, well, why would God create things that could only hurt things? And he said, well, no, God didn't create them that way. That's clearly the result of the fall.
Okay. I have that book somewhere in my library. I'll have to look that up. But as I said, I don't know everything Dr. Geiser caught, because he wrote a lot, over 100 books.
Oh, he did, yes.
This is my mainstream news question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you accept the assured findings of modern science as far as age and evolution?
Well, I think here we actually have a distinction that I think, again, Dr. Geiser pioneered the distinction between operational and origin science. You see, when it comes to science that we can test in the present and repeat and observe, there's nothing in that actually points to an age. The question of age, a question of creation or evolution, they're examples of historical science. And Dr. Geiser made this point very strongly in books and at the Arkansas creation trial in 81, I think it was. And also, even evolutionists have admitted that evolution's a historical science. It's different from mathematics or physics, where you do experiments. Evolution's a claim about history, and so is creation a claim about history. So it's actually a different view of history.
Mm.
I don't dispute any observation any scientist makes, okay? I don't dispute any data they may adduce. It's a question of how do we interpret it? What framework of history do we use to interpret the data? Do we have this history of uniformitarianism where everything's gone on gradually, there's been no miraculous creative acts, or do we realize that God has done special things in history?
Yeah, you're making me think again, and I've mentioned this on a previous episode. Sir Arthur Eddington,
Mm-hmm.
he uses the story of the fisherman looking for what kind of creatures live in the deep sea.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets a big net with a 3-inch mesh,
Mm-hmm.
and scours the bottom. And when he pulls it up, he discovers there's no creature smaller than 3 inches in the ocean.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah. So same thing with materialistic naturalism, or philosophical or naturalism, as opposed to methodological naturalism. You're ruling out part of the picture to start with, and it kind of points you into certain directions. Whether anything else is true or not is irrelevant to, we're going to have answers that fit within this category.
Well, I think the methodological natural is fine for operational science. It makes no sense for historical science.
In
a lab, I'd use methodological naturalism in my physics lab, my spectroscopy lab. I would expect things to go on normally. I think God upholds his creation in a regular, repeatable way most of the time, and miracles are additions to those for extraordinary times.
Yeah, I mean, how would you do otherwise? Otherwise, you having to posit something supernatural for everything. So I understand
Well, I mean, I've been a teacher at university before and marking exams, and okay, why is the spectroscopic frequency the way it is? And someone said, well, God made it that way. I marked it wrong. That's not an acceptable answer when it comes to operational science.
Sure. Yeah, tomorrow I'm going to have a philosopher of science on here, and
okay.
He's also a Christian, and he makes a distinction between, and this is not just him, but in philosophy of science in general, between realist and anti-realist theories, where the realist theory says this theory describes things as they are, and an anti-realist theory says this theory is helpful for making predictions and kind of formulates a story we can tell, but it doesn't necessarily have to reflect what actually happened. So he makes the point many times that well, when you're studying astronomy or whatever, that can be realist science, whereas the theory of evolution by definition has to be anti-realist, because you can't test the methodology of. It's kind of the same thing you're saying with origin and operational science, but from a different perspective. It's just another way of looking at the same distinction, I think. So I'm looking forward to discussing his thoughts on
That'd be interesting,
how science works. Yes. So for yourself, how do you balance the authority of the Bible with the findings of science? How do you decide what goes where?
Well, I mean, okay, in the CMI, authority of the Bible is paramount, because, I mean, Jesus said Scripture can't be broken. Jesus, over and over again, affirmed the Bible says it happened. God said it. Have you not read what God has spoken to you? You see, what we read in the Scriptures, what God has spoken. And also the Bible is unfallen revelation from God, and therefore we should use that to understand nature, which we live in a fallen world. So we're looking at nature as it has fallen. We're looking at a fallen world, not the way God originally made things, and therefore we need the unfallen revelation of Scripture to understand the fallen world we live in. I mean, look at the book of Ecclesiastes, for instance. That's actually what happens if all you have is everything under the sun, and you're looking at it from a naturalistic perspective. You think, well, I mean, the dead know nothing, because that's what we see using empirical science. And so at the end of Ecclesiastes, the preacher says, well, the only thing I can think of is fear God and obey his commandments, you see, because clearly pure empiricism does not explain life.
Yeah.
It can't even explain itself. I mean, you can't do an experiment to prove empiricism is true.
In general, for the part of the world that accepts the assured findings of modern science, they accept radiometric dating as accurate and authoritative. Is there a problem with radiometric dating?
Well, I mean, for instance, if you assume radiometric dating is perfect, well, the carbon-14 part of it points to a much younger Earth. And that's a diamond is about as perfect a system as you can get for radiometric dating. There's no contamination possible, and no leakage in or out is possible. Every radiometric dating method has some unstable isotope called the parent atom, and it decays to a daughter, which is stable, and might be a few things in between. So there are certain things to try to assume here is that we know the initial amounts of the parent and the daughter. That's what we have to assume. I mean, they can tell us what they think it is, but it's still an assumption. What was the initial amount? I mean, you can think of it as like a bath. You've got a bath that's been filled. It's 20 gallons of water in the bath, and the taps, the faucet is flowing at 2 gallons per minute. So how long did it take the bath to fill? Now you could answer 20 divided by 10 gives you 10 minutes, but in fact, you're assuming that the bath was empty to start with. So I didn't tell you that. You actually made an assumption of the initial conditions, and then you assumed it wasn't leaking. Like if the plug's leaking, it's going to change the alteration. Or if your wife is helpful and the water's not warm enough, pours a jug of boiled water into it, you see. So you got this outside interference with it. And then, of course, when you think of filling up the bath, you might put the hot tap on first, and then you put the cold in, you see. So you're changing the flow rate as you're going, you see. So the assumptions are initial conditions. Has the system been closed? And has the rate been constant? And all those assumptions can be questioned, and in fact they are questioned when the radiometric date doesn't match the date they want from the fossils. And you've got plenty of examples of that, where if it doesn't match what they want, they won't publish it, or they will try to excuse why it didn't match what it was. And in fact, when you send something to a radiometric lab, they ask you for the estimated age of the thing. I thought they're supposed to tell you that.
Yeah.
The thing is, they realize their assumptions, therefore they'll try and adjust the assumptions to give you the estimated age in that ballpark. And also, we find often that the radiometric dates don't agree when we actually know the age of something. Like, for instance, in Ngauruhoe, you might know that volcano as Mount Doom from Lord of the Rings.
Yes. In New Zealand.
Yes, that's what it was. I grew up there in New Zealand. You see, lava flows, which we know happened in the 1950s, they became hard rock, and then they were sent to a radiometric dating lab and got dates of many millions and even billions of years for rocks we know were 50 years old.
Wow.
So it means if we can't trust it on rocks of known age, so why should we trust it on rocks of unknown age, where it disagrees with the divinely revealed biblical chronology? It happens quite more often than people realize. And see, where you are in the Grand Canyon, they've actually done dates of the same rock with different methods and got different ages for the same rock. Ooh.
There's the Grand Canyon.
So it's a problem when you've got the dating methods which are supposedly infallible, yet they don't agree. So that seems to point to the rate hasn't been constant. There's been an acceleration that affected different isotopes differently, depending on the half-life, depending on whether it's alpha or beta decaying, things like that. And that's what our colleagues, the RATE project, have been working on. Or they worked on it. The rate is over now, but
sure. So
there's some good work on that.
I've not read the results. So did they determine that there was a specific cause that caused the rates to change?
Well, I think what they've done is quite often what's happened in science, we know that something a phenomenon has occurred, like differential acceleration of rates, which is also why you have a lot of helium and zircons, which is a result of radioactive alpha decay, but there hasn't been enough time for the helium to leak out. You know, it's like you make a helium balloon, blow it up, and the helium leaks in such a tiny, small, tiny single atom gas leaks through things. So we can work out how fast it should be leaking, and the thing hasn't been around very long. Otherwise, the helium would have leaked out already.
Mm.
So we actually, here's a phenomenon, accelerated decay has happened. Why it happened, they're not quite sure.
Okay.
But then you think of Newton, he knew gravitational attraction happened. He basically said, I've got no idea about the cause of this.
Mm.
He didn't say God did it. He just said, I've got no idea about the cause.
Right. He could measure he could calculate
Yeah.
the inverse square law, etc., but he didn't have an idea of how it actually occurred.
Yeah, that's it. But so it's quite common. You know there's a phenomenon, something is happening without knowing the underlying cause of that phenomenon.
I see. So the next question was all going to be, was there death before the fall? Obviously, you've covered that one already, but does that include bacteria and plants?
No, it includes, I mean, it's humans. See, the problem, even with human death, is quite vexing because you have Homo sapiens fossils, which according to evolutionary dating methods have been dated about over 300,000 years ago.
Hmm.
Undoubted Homo sapiens, we're Homo sapiens, you and I, all of us are Homo sapiens. And so Homo sapiens fossils dated 300,000+ years ago is far older than a biblical date for Adam.
Hmm.
So human death alone, I think, is overlooked by a lot of our old Earth brethren. Is an issue of human death before sin because they've got a problem with that. And then you've got animal death, for instance, you've got the prophet Isaiah in 11:63 talking about this future state where there be the lion and the calf and the wolf and the lamb and the poisonous snake and the little child leading them.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, there's no more death or destroying in my holy mountain. So in fact, when you look at the commentators on Isaiah, like Alec Motch's Isaiah commentary, he says, well, Isaiah was clearly thinking of Eden. He was expecting his readers to think of Eden where there was where animals had a vegetarian diet.
So,
okay.
So did the lions have different teeth in Eden?
Well, I mean, it's possible. I don't know if they needed them because sharp teeth can be used for plant eating. In fact, we've actually published an article about lions actually being vegetarian. You see in the World War II, often the zoos actually fed vegetables to the so-called carnivores. They can survive on it. And sharp teeth are good for eating things. Like, in fact, bears, we are mostly vegetarian. They can eat animals, but a sign on a zoo in Australia said, well, although bears have meat-eating teeth, their diet's mostly plant.
Oh, that's interesting.
And a panda, it's got sharp teeth and claws and eats bamboo. That's all it does.
Okay, so the teeth don't necessarily reflect the diet.
They don't necessarily, no. In fact, you even got theropod dinosaurs. The dinosaur T-Rex is a theropod, Velociraptor is a theropod. They actually found that when you look at the dung of the theropods, they clearly ate a lot of plants too.
So on to another issue.
I do think animal carnivory began after the fall and was before the flood. I think humans weren't allowed to be carnivorous until God said after the flood, well, I gave you the green plants for food. See, I gave you green plants, vegetarian, but now I'm letting you eat meat. Okay, by the time of the flood, though, animals clearly had already been eating meat, though.
Right.
Because you got coprolites, dung, fossilized dung. They've clearly been eating other animals because they've gone through the animal system. Okay, you've got places. Sometimes you have the remains of some things inside where the stomach was and the fossil. So clearly, by the time of the flood, where the fossils were formed, you've got meat eating. You've got T-Rex tooth embedded in a hadrosaur, duck-billed dinosaur tailbone, which healed. So therefore, it was a predator, and the would-be prey survived the attack.
Temporarily.
Yeah, exactly. But when it comes to plants, plants are not nefesh chaya. You see, the Bible uses the term nefesh chaya. When God made Adam from the dust, and then he breathed upon him, and Adam became a nefesh chaya, a living soul. But the word means living creature. It's used of the whales, the fish, the beasts of the earth, and the birds are nefesh chaya. Plants are not nefesh chaya, so plant death in the Bible doesn't count.
So different.
See, plants in the Bible were withering. They withered. They didn't die. So plant death doesn't count. When I'm talking about no death before the fall, I'm not talking about plant death or bacterial death or the dead skin cells in your hair or the outer layer of skin. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about nefesh hayah, things which are biblically alive.
Hmm. So you mentioned that humans became meat eaters after the flood. Many people today, and certainly basically everyone who's not a Christian, believes that there was never a worldwide flood.
Of course not.
Evidence? Well, of course, God's judgment's not going to be popular, but what evidence is there that Noah's flood was, or God's flood during Noah's time was worldwide?
Okay, the biblical one is that you have the language in Genesis is full of universal quantifiers, all the high mountains under the entire heavens. You see, you got the double all. In Hebrew, the word is kol, and you got the double kol construction there. And see, sometimes all is not used literally of everything, but when you have the double kol there, there's no exception to it being a universal type. And then you think of all the universal language, or everything outside the ark was destroyed. Only Noah was left. Every human, every beast, this repeated universal language. It's like God. I mean, how much clearer does God have to be with all this universal language he's piling on? And local floods don't last a whole year. I mean, why build an ark if it's just a local flood? Just do what like Lot did from Sodom. Just leave it, migrate.
Yeah, go somewhere
There's
else.
no need to migrate, to build an ark if it's a local flood. Rainbow promise, what did God promise not to do? I'm never going to do this again. Do what again? Do a local flood again? Which means that God has broken his promise, because there have been plenty of very nasty local floods. You see, so what God promised was never another global flood. And as far as science is concerned, the evidence is enormously wide, continent-wide rock layers, even correlating across the continent. So you got a cause of these rock layers that is incredibly large. Often they're very thin and very flat, but also rapidly formed, because, I mean, how do you get a fossil? Have you ever seen fossilized roadkill?
No.
No, exactly. So to get a fossil, you have to bury it quickly. And that's what we see in these rock layers, these things which must have been buried quickly. Otherwise, they would have rotted away. You wouldn't find the fossils, even especially with soft tissue, unless they've been buried quickly. But sometimes the layers they're buried in are huge continent-wide layers, you see. So whatever caused these catastrophic layers had an extremely wide extent. And then you got layers which clearly must have happened one after the other with very little time. I mean, behind you, you look at the layers there, they're very flat. It's a pancake. Okay, but then you look at the surface, how jagged the Grand Canyon is.
Yeah.
So the thing is, if the layer had been exposed for millions of years, why doesn't the layer look like the surface of the Grand Canyon with all the erosion, millions of years of erosion? It should look like the Grand Canyon surface, but in fact, there's been no time for erosion. So you've got one layer and then next layer before there's any chance for erosion. And sometimes the layers have things like footprints in them. You see, I mean, how long does a footprint last?
Not long, in my experience.
Exactly. So when you have a layer with footprints, it means the next layer must have come in and cemented in place really quickly before the footprint had a chance to erode. So you've got these features which are called ephemeral markings, which show that there can't have been much time between the layers. So you've got this threefold thing: incredibly wide layers, every one of them must have been catastrophically formed to have fossils in, but also very little time between the layers.
Well, more specifically, on an issue that's become more prevalent in the press recently, is particularly in China, the discovery of feathered dinosaurs, they say.
Oh, yes.
Archaeopteryx and others, are they birds? Are they dinosaurs? They like to say they're a transitional form.
Well, see, I think Archaeopteryx was seen to be a total bird. It had fully formed feathers. It had feathers which are elliptical like a modern flying bird. They got special designed aerodynamic feathers. So clearly Archaeopteryx was a flyer. It had a perching claw, so it wasn't a running dinosaur. It was clearly a perching bird, and it had an avian-type brain case and an avian-type upper jaw, because our jaws, only the lower one really moves. The other one's attached to the skull. But the bird, though, both move, and the Archaeopteryx had that sort of motion, which is a bird-like motion, bird-like brain case, bird-like wings. See, the thing is, I'm not convinced of the so-called feathered dinosaurs. One is the provenance. I think too many of them do come from China. I'm not really satisfied with the provenance of some of them. I mean, you might find some fossil hunter, he sells it to them, but where was it? Where was it exactly? You got this infamous case of the Archaeoraptor fraud, the Piltdown bird, you might call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, a bird and a reptile. It's clearly a forgery. So what I'd like to say, I'm not saying that feathered dinosaurs could not happen, okay? I'm not saying that God could not create a feathered dinosaur. There's nothing in the Bible that says that dinosaurs had no feathers, okay? I'm not saying that, but I'm saying I'm not convinced that you have real feathers on creatures which are real dinosaurs. See, dinosaurs had very distinct features. They had a distinct skull. They had distinct hip bones with the vertical upright leg. They had a hole in the hip bone where the three hip bones joined together. There's a hole there called the acetabulum, and dinosaurs are the only creatures where it was a hole there as opposed to a solid where the three bones draw. So I want to see something with a hole in the acetabulum plus real feathers that weren't just frayed collagen fibers. I mean, Sinosauropteryx, for instance, it seems that the fibers were not individual things, but were part of a crest. It seems like they were part of a single flap of skin or a crest. And when we think it was actually in lake sediments, it would have helped it as a swimming creature to have this crest on the tail. It'd actually make it far more of a swimmer if it could paddle like a crocodile would do, for instance. So it looks like there weren't feathers as part of a dermal crest. So, I mean, I've written quite a lot on feathered dinosaurs over the last 20 years or so, and I'm not convinced by any of the candidates.